Hey, Polly.
Hey Greg, how are you?
I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
Very good.
That's good.
Thanks for asking.
Oh, anytime. So today, though we're all laughs, today we kick off our partnership with Gloria Crist on our Griefology Living, Loving, and Loss segment.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to be talking all about grief, the different forms, the way it manifests, and how we could deal with it, cope with it,
hmm
and what different forms or what grief actually looks like.
And this is gonna be a series.
This will be a series, a three-part series. When approached by Gloria, she had this great idea. She's a totally preventable alum. I know she's a creative and an expressive arts.
I was
Um,
gonna say, I think we should say at least three parts, because knowing Gloria, she might bring more to the table,
she might,
right?
she might, she is a genius. So Gloria has lined up a great panel, and today we're starting our panel off with Sandra Salzillo. We'll be
Okay.
talking about Soul Collage, which is something I haven't heard of. But again, this is a resource that we have right here in Rhode Island that we don't even know about.
Okay. Super. Can't wait to learn more about it.
So without further ado, today joining us on Totally Preventable, we have Gloria Crist, who has created this, not even created this, but brought to us this topic of grief. And I wouldn't do it justice if I announced our guest. So I'm going to ask Gloria if she can announce our special guest. That would be great.
I would love to. Hi, everybody, and thank you for bringing Griefology, Living, Loving, and Loss, to its creation, because I think if you look at ologies, it's the study of, right? And that's what we are highlighting, because I don't think grief is talked about. And this came to be because I do so much work with children and young people and began to notice how that young people were symptomatic of this thing, the way they hold their body, their inability to express. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is grief. This is loss. This is post-pandemic, maybe. This is living with where we are as a collective. And griefology seemed to be something important. And so I'm really happy to be here. And I am honored to introduce our first guest in this special three-part series. Um, Sandy Salzillo has a Master of Arts, a CAGS, LMHC. She got her BFA from the University of Dartmouth and Mass, and for several years was in the field of illustration and design. She has the soul of an artist, and then went back in 2001 and got her holistic counseling from Salve and got an advanced graduate degree in mental health, along with her degree in what's a CAGS at Salve and expressive arts. Um, she she then took her whole entire body of knowledge and joined the staff at Women's and Infants and worked exclusively in the women's oncology department, working with women in the expressive arts component. And when you are working in a department like oncology and you're working with women who are dealing with levels of loss, levels of death, levels of grief, um, I can't think of anyone better to be placed in that department to help women learn how to express the layers of grief and loss through the creative. She then went on to work with Care New England and work with families, part of the Care New England in a counseling position. And then in 2023, she left that position to expand her private practice. She's a certified archetypal analyst through the Assisi Institute and has studied Jungian psychology for years. Um, and most recently became certified as a Soul Collage facilitator. And she's going to talk about that in a minute. And I have actually been in a couple of Soul Collage workshops, and it is a very powerful way to work with the unconscious and grief and what comes out in images. She's lectured locally, she's lectured internationally on the importance of using the creative process with a mental health care practice to promote a deeper engagement with emotional well-being. She is a master in helping individuals, specifically women, but also, you know, as women, we have all of these parts of our lives where grief, loss, trauma, you know, it trickles down, there's a residue. But she is a master in helping women sit with grief, loss, trauma, and create portals to allow them the opportunity to express and transform. And I can't think of a better way to kick off this series than to introduce you all to Sandra Salzillo.
Thank you so much, Gloria. I really appreciate you inviting me to Totally Preventable, and I really appreciate that. Well, you know me, and it's wonderful to be known in that way. You know, more than just the words on the paper, but really know me and know what I'm trying to do and what I'm about. So I want to just start this talk by, I always like to use a quote when I do a lecture or start any kind of public thing, my workshops, my Soul Collage workshops, and even, you know, and for this talk. And one of the pieces I always quote from is from the Odyssey, which is a simple sentence that says, "And the sun set, and all the journeying ways were darkened." So that is really an introduction to what I think is this whole piece about when the sun sets, or the sun or the day or the ego space that we know, then we so quickly lose our way into the part of the journeying or the moving toward what's not known. And grief is a way, is one of the ways to do that with the right kind of, the right kinds of interventions. And, you know, I just want to say right off the bat that, you know, the way I work is not always, it's not the traditional ways of working, although I have, and I really want to be clear of this, I have all the traditional ways of being trained. I am licensed, I can do CBT, you know, I can do traditional therapies, and most of the time it's getting to know the person and getting to sit with the person before any of these things are in my private practice are introduced. So does that make a little sense? I just wanted to be clear about those two things. So the sun set and the journeying ways were darkened. So what does that really mean? And how does self-expression and meaning making facilitate the pain and despair of the soul that is grieving? So what does that really mean? You know, grief, a portal for possibilities of self-expression and meaning making. What does that really mean? And how does self-expression and meaning making facilitate the pain and the despair of the soul that is grieving? So in our society, grief is often a solitary experience. You know, our culture denies the rituals that our ancestors practiced through a grieving process, meaning that the process of transformation is not a validated experience of grief and/or a not natural part of the grieving process for most individuals. You know, in our culture, it's, you know, a wake, a funeral, a celebration of life, and then you're on your own. You know, and those rituals can be meaningful and they have their purpose, but they're very brief pieces of our experience, and they don't really, and they kind of stop there. after it's all over, it's like, what are you supposed to do? Because there are very few places in our culture that a community will hold space for the grieving person. And really, after the pandemic, the grief support group systems that were out there have become even fewer. So in the past couple of years, it's been really difficult for me to find support groups for a lot of my people that were grieving, a lot of the women that were grieving, because I think a lot of these things have not really come back online with the frequency that they had been before. So that's another piece. So then what are you left with? How do we get through this? And when we're working with the creative unconscious, which is where dreams and the ability to make artwork and the ability to get out of the ego space of having to try to figure everything out, or, what do I do next? This affords a very different kind of more way of working with grief that isn't customary and isn't available to a lot of us. So Jung writes, Jung has a quote that I think also speaks to this. He says, the psyche consists essentially of images. And when I say Jung, I mean Carl Jung. The psyche consists essentially of images. It is a series of images in the truest sense, a structure that is throughout full of meaning and purpose. It is a picturing of vital activities. Mind and body are the expression of a single entity. This living being appears outwardly as the material body, but inwardly as a series of images of the vital activities taking place within it. And that comes from a piece he wrote called Spirit and Life. So we have an outward body functioning on the ego plane, but we're so misinformed and disconnected by the fact that we have this whole other resource called the creative unconscious, showing up in dreams, showing up in what Gloria spoke about, the tap on the shoulder saying, you have this idea, you have this knowledge, you have this experience that you're trying to put out to the culture. This being on this whole totally preventable grief is actually a ritual. We've created, Gloria and the two of you have used your platform, your podcast, as a ritual space to talk about these things. So that is what I mean by really creating a place of knowledge, a place of support that isn't in the traditional, just, you can call up and do this. So again, what you're doing and what Gloria has created is something that our culture is desperately needing. So what have I come to know of grief? Grief is unwavering. Patients often say to me, when will this stop? When will I feel, normal? When will life have, be the way it was? And with a cancer diagnosis, these were the questions that came to me all the time. And, my answer usually was, it doesn't. It's not. It's not. It's not supposed to. We think it's supposed to. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to be, it's never going to be that way. So why spend the energy trying to make things be as they were when things are constantly changing and constantly moving us in ways we really don't know that are coming, So all of a sudden you have this life, and then you have a cancer diagnosis, and that changes everything. How could you go back? You can't unknow what you know now. So the choices are, you know, and a lot of people get stuck in that place. And that creates a whole nother problem, a whole nother uh, psychological way of staying stuck, and then becoming angry, and then becoming bitter, and then all the, you know, the more, you know, non-generative ways of
Or
expressing.
addicted, or,
Yeah.
or, or,
Creating all of these things,
yeah.
right, because again, I say this later on in this talk that I designed, but it seems like it's going off on its own, so I'm just going to go with it.
Yeah.
But grief is also an expression of our traumatic experiences. So when you're working with grief, especially, you know, when I was working at the hospital, there was the shock, you know, the freeze, you know, that flight or
Yeah.
fight and freeze thing that happens where you're not even hearing what the doctor's saying after a while, because you totally go into that, you know, into that shock. Um, but once, you know, women were in their treatment and they had their surgery or they were having their chemo, and I would start to talk to them, because I was also I brought the expressive arts to women and infants, but I was a therapist there as well. So I would see women in counseling, as well as do the support groups and the art groups and all of that additionally. But there was always so much trauma under the diagnosis. So and when you lose a loved one, it's the loss of the loved one, but it's also the loss of the self that you had the potential to be, depending on the amount of trauma that you've had in your life. So
I-
you can't go ahead. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you're bringing trauma in, because I think a lot of people think of grief as just loss, you know, like a lot of people I know just associate grief with a death, and not other traumas. I recently have come to realize I obviously have a father and a grandfather, because, you know, biologically, but they weren't in my life. And lately I have been noticing, like, I have grief that I didn't have strong men in my life, right? Not because they have passed away, just because they weren't there. And I think a lot of people don't recognize those other traumas that bring grief into their lives. And I think that's where a lot of buildup is. And
Exactly.
yeah.
I am so glad to hear you say this out loud, because that's the culture
Mhm.
that Andy is talking about. It's the culture of, oh, somebody died, so I have grief. And it automatically shuts down your system to recognize what's attached to that kind of loss. And I want to point out something else that is coming to life out of the systems. You know, we know the fight or flight, or the freeze. There's another level of this now, and it's called the fawn. You're fawning. Oh, I'm sorry. Or, oh, you know, it's okay. I won't do it again. And all of that is attached to
Trauma.
loss,
Yeah.
trauma,
And trauma.
because the recognition and the awareness has not happened. And the other element that I think is really interesting that you've also mentioned already is, even reading through this, grief is unwavering. People tend to think, our culture tends to think, oh, someone died, I'm sad, I'm good. And that is not the case.
Yeah.
There is a residue to grief that speaks to what Polly just said.
Exactly.
It's, well, wait a minute. My father's in my life because I have a father, but I have all of these feelings attached to the loss of a father because my father wasn't present in my life. That is
And,
loss. That is
and,
trauma.
yeah, and what's really interesting is, if you've worked or are working on your trauma, on trauma, grief is and you lose someone, but but you've been working right along, or you've been experiencing other ways of knowing. It's a different kind of grief, if that makes sense, because you have more information available, but what grief does is open up that portal of trauma, because at that point that you might need help, but the help is witnessing the grief while processing the trauma, because most people aren't really aware that what you do. And Polly, I'm sure you can relate to this, is we build up all kinds of defense mechanisms about the pain that we've experienced from relationships that weren't available to us in our life, and that could have really impacted or informed our life in a different way. But we just say, well, I have biological people, I don't know these people, but there's a loss in that.
Mhm.
The possibility of something doesn't happen.
Right.
And trauma work is about creating those possibilities again, because you're aware of them now. You have awareness about them, and you see some of the behaviors that you adapted not serving you as well as they did in the past, because now you're seeing things through that lens. That portal gets opened up. So there's, it's like trauma, grief, trauma.
Mhm.
I really see that working together. So, you know, yes, so grief is unwavering, and it washes over our entire being without permission, without forewarning, and without limits. Um, Yet in this stratosphere of disorientation, I found in my own grief work, by studying Jungian analysis and dream analysis, and by visually processing emotions that were too difficult to access, that slowly over time, I was able to um, be in a place where I could work in oncology. So, as Gloria had mentioned earlier, I had been, I did have a life, a previous life as a painter, an illustrator, a visual artist. And I started painting at 8. And it was interesting one night I was sitting around with my brother, and we were just talking, and, other members of my family. And I said something like, I find it so interesting that my art used to be so important. It was like my whole life, and now I don't really paint anymore. And I love the work that I do now. And my brother said, well, you were painting to do your own therapy work and so it isn't really a stretch or a surprise that it ended up here. So this is almost, so it's very personal to talk about this, because has really been the unfolding of my life by doing the work that I do. It's like I had to do it first, and I had to understand it first, and I had to embody what I was trying to offer to other people. And so when I was working in oncology, and I go to a party and you meet people and you say, what do you do? And I say, well, I work in oncology, and everybody you go, oh my God, this woman works with cancer. I don't want to be near you. But I mean, that's just how fearful we are about what we don't understand. Right?
Yeah.
And I think, so I would like you to talk about that portal in relation to your history of painting and creating images, the Takken book of symbols, and also how you use Soul Collage to work with that portal and patients, because using Soul Collage as a certified facilitator, which is very powerful powerful, powerful work. That's a kind of painting. That's a
It's totally, well, any image, any visual image, whether it's a drawing, it's a collage, a quilt making. I mean, look at the AIDS quilt, right? A way of honoring, a loved one through an image on fabric. I mean, any of these things. An image is the portal. The psyche, the psyche speaks through images, you know? And so it doesn't, one of the reasons is, so I don't want to jump. Let me backtrack a little bit, Gloria, just to give an example, because you mentioned the Taschen Book of Symbols, which is, it's like the Holy Grail. It's available. You can buy it. It came out about, I don't even remember how long it's been around, but it hasn't been around like years and years. But it's the Holy Grail of images and beautifully written pieces. And it's from a Jungian slant of what these pieces mean what these symbols mean on an archetypal level, meaning what they have always meant in other societies, how we can interpret these images when they show up in our art or in our dreams. So I'm going to give one example of one of my patients, and then we can talk more about the Soul Collage. But so I had a couple of case studies, and so this is a woman I was working with at Women and Infants at the hospital, and it was June 25th, 2014. I was doing one of my, she was in the art group. She was in the expressive arts group I did, which started with a guided meditation. And then the patients would kind of relax, and I would just kind of gently lead them in a way to let whatever was coming up show up for them. And then they had a table covered with materials, and they could draw or paint whatever image, wherever they found this guided meditation taking them. So this woman had done a painting of a lot of waves and a kind of unsteady bridge, and she wrote under the painting, navigating through the stormy waters of life, sometimes feeling the unpredictable turmoil of waves, and sometimes crossing safely above the waves. And then a few months later, she came back to see me for a counseling session, and she had a dream. And so the dream she brought to me was, I dreamt that I was crossing a bridge in the pouring rain. The rain was torrential, and as I tried to cross the bridge, I kept walking through heavy, sloshy water. Beneath me were sharks and huge waves. I tried not to look down and to keep moving, knowing I would eventually reach the other side. So what is this patient's psyche trying to express to her? She has this image in a guided meditation, and then she has this image a few months later in a dream. So this is now I'm kind of having an idea of what it might mean, because objectively, what is a bridge? Like the bridge on your totally preventable logo right there. What does a bridge do? Right? It connects one place to another place, the conscious to the unconscious. So I looked it up in the Taschen Book of Symbols, and it said that its explanation or its idea of a bridge is that it's a structure and a pathway, a linking of opposing sides of a landscape, often separated by a void. The latter may take many forms: the depth of a river, a lake, a waterfall, a chasm in the earth, the gap between two people given differences in language, personality, or goals, the mythological breach between heaven and earth, conscious and unconscious, time and eternity. So that's the piece, the mythological, the archetypal, what has this always, what has this always been? Now, when you have stage 4 cancer and your dreams and your artwork from the unconscious is sending you images of bridges, and mythologically and objectively, you are crossing into a different place. You are crossing into a different place. Now, was she scared by this? Was she, she had, it wasn't me telling her these things, it was her own psyche telling her these things. I mean, I don't tell people, oh, this is what your dream is. Blah, blah, blah. I don't do that. I'm just saying, well, when we know this, and we know about this, and let's look at the mythological meaning. Let's look at what other cultures, other societies have done with this. But really, these for this patient and other patients I work with, these images become talismans. They're symbolic. They open the portal because they're symbolic ways of talking about what's happening to me.
And so in a totally preventable context, especially if you work with prevention coalitions who are dealing with drug overdoses, mothers who have lost a child to overdose, individuals who are unhoused or not getting proper nutrition. Is it expected that we can say to these individuals, oh, you just need to make some art?
No.
Because that's
no, and I don't want to say, and I'm
right. And so please explain that there is a process to the portal, and there is a process to acknowledge the pathway to the portal. And I think it's important that individuals who are experiencing layers of loss and grief and trauma connect with individuals who walk the walk and talk the talk so that grief can be expressed in a way that is transformative, right? So please talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's our capitalistic society's fault. I mean, really. I mean, what's in place at in these institutions that are, I mean, everybody's got all they can do to get someone safe and to get some, I mean, but at the same time, you mentioned, mothers grieving the loss of their child. Well, call me up. I'll do a soul collage for that group. I mean, it's like we have to find out who we all are so we can put pieces together. Again, that's why this podcast and what you are doing at Totally Preventable is educating, right? We have to educate people to know that these things are out there. Now, to speak to someone in the throes of addiction, there is time and there is time for that, but it can't be in a crisis. I mean, crisis intervention is crisis intervention. Then resourcing, right, out of that is when people that do what I do can sit with someone in that place. I know at Butler, I don't know if it's available in the addiction unit, but I do know there are, and there are expressive arts therapists at Butler.
Yeah. And
I don't know if they're doing the dream stuff, but
this is what I'm circling back to is the process you laid out. A woman comes to you with a diagnosis of stage 4. You don't automatically say, okay, let's get a piece of paper and do, because you have to do crisis intervention, because that's a crisis that has all of these things that go with a crisis. And there is this process, which I love because I'm guessing that it wasn't diagnosis to guided meditation to expressive arts to counseling. There was this beautiful process in the unbeautiful context of grief and crisis that had to happen so that that access could be available.
Right, right. And the way that the expressive arts group worked, it was open to anybody. I mean, I never knew from week to week who was showing up.
Mm-hmm.
Now I did have, I did have a lot of regulars. The women who really liked it would come every single week. And then as more and more of my responsibilities at the hospital morphed into other things, the group just became monthly. But like I said, you're absolutely right. I mean, there were 4 other social workers that would happen to meet other women. We always had a social worker with every new diagnosed woman in the room. There was always a social worker present. We had a department of 6 people. Now I think the last time I heard it, there's only 1 person. So the expressive arts programs, the integrative care programs that used to be available are not what they were at the time that I left, which is another story, because that's the systems we're in right now.
And now I'm looking at that bridge totally in a whole new light, you guys, because I also know from, monthly meetings, how many connectors you guys have throughout the communities that are pieces of the bridge. So, see, this is why I love doing stuff like that.
I know.
All this stuff comes to light, and these like little light, it is the ology. It is the ology of understanding what we are dealing with.
Mhm.
And you have to introduce knowledgeable individuals who can be at both sides of the bridge, right? Because otherwise you miss a step. You miss a step in that process. And so you have another quote here, and I know I'm jumping, but it's because
That's
there's
okay. This is turning up to perfect.
so grief is an all-abiding factor of life. Mourning is the way we express it.
Hmm.
So talk on that, please. Just a little bit.
Yes. And again, I think it's really important that you brought up, because I don't want this to seem like this is a lofty, intellectual thing, because it really isn't. It's just that there are, like you said, there are steps to this process. I don't give someone just a piece of paper, and I wish I could be in more places than I am. But you have to sit, right, Gloria? We have to sit with what we're being presented with before we know. And that's a valuable tool in and of itself.
And by definition, it is not going to be one 50-minute session.
Oh God, no.
Yeah.
It's going to be years.
Sitting with what is presented, with everything that falls under grief or trauma, or recognizing what that itch is in the center of your soul, is not one and done.
Or even allowing yourself to say that you have a soul that has its own way of knowing and being, and has a language that I never, no one ever told me I could access that.
Yeah.
No one ever told me that there was wisdom inside of me. Carl Jung talks about the, I don't know, 1 million-year-old person that we all have this ancestral connection to the ancestors, to the people who've gone before us, to this wisdom, this embodied wisdom that's in nature, that's in our experiences of those profound moments, you know, when you're walking on the bike path and a hawk flies down and stares at you in the face, right? You know, that's a soul moment. Something from nature is connecting with you that doesn't randomly happen on any given day. So so the fact that once people understand that they have a soul, they can have this inner life. How rich is that from just living in this capitalist society that doesn't make sense? That is always telling us, you need this will make you feel better. Go here, have a ton of sugar, have a ton of alcohol. Because what is it all trying to do? It's all trying to numb the pain.
Right.
And the pain is the mourning. And and the soul is and it's allowing the pain a an artery to move through, which will go back into the body in a more healing way. Now, when I say healing, does that mean curing? No, but it means approaching a your own death, approaching a loved one's death in a very different way. Pain is not supposed to be numbed out. Pain needs to be felt and held. And if your
Wait,
dream,
say that again. Say that again, because a lot of people don't say that. And it is a very real component to life and for everybody. Everybody knows grief in some capacity, especially in the way that we're talking about it. So say that statement again, please.
pain is not supposed to be numbed out. Pain is supposed to be felt. Pain is supposed to be the shadow in the room that speaks to you.
I just think for years, generations, it's always been taught, especially to young boys, men, young men. You're not supposed to show your pain. So they're often in times of grief and times of trauma, they're often leaned on because they're supposed to be, you know, the strong one. You're supposed to hold the family together, and they don't get that time to grieve, and they don't get that time to mourn, and they try and hide the pain. So hearing you say that pain, you know, you're supposed to, you know, live through that pain, feel that pain. I think it's going to be a hard concept, but I wholeheartedly admire that you said that, so people can understand that it's okay to feel pain.
But here's the, you know, as Shakespeare would say, but here therein is the rub, right? Because we, you know, especially for men, you know, they totally are not, you know, why are they so in pain? Why are they, you know, why are they dealing with, you know, depression and untreated depression and addiction and things that they don't, you know, that they can't even articulate because they're not, you know, that idea was not presented to them. I mean, and the trauma in childhood and not being able to have a way to be held, you know, that attachments um that never get, you know, broken attachments that never get held back, you know, held. I mean, who's going to hold the space for the pain? Those are two. So we live in a society that is really opposed to understanding that, no, wait a minute. And this is when I go back to ritual, you know, in indigenous cultures, when someone was in pain or in grief, the whole village held that person. You know, there were ceremonies for that person. It wasn't your grief alone. It was the tribe's grief. It was the village's grief. You know, the trauma was held because your trauma was my trauma. your grief was my grief. And then we evolved into this, antiseptic kind of, I don't want to hear, I'm a man. I don't know what to do with my pain, so I'm shutting it down. And how
But
many,
women too.
and women too, but
Yeah.
I think, Gloria, because a lot of what I see with the women patients, what they, oh, I have to, they become over caregivers. It's like, oh, I have to take care of my children, even though I'm, in a horrible place, or I can't let anybody know that I really feel like this, right? They have to put the face on and kind of keep going. So there's that over caregiver expression that I see for women, and then there's the, which is a way to stuff pain, which is a trauma response, because it's not about you, it's about your need to make sure you're taking care of everybody else, which is very, very destructive. So, and both ways are ways of shutting down, and both are expressions of trauma.
So Sandra, can you tell us a little bit about Soul Collage and how the community can become involved?
So Soul Collage is a process that was designed by a woman, Sina Frost, and she was in Jungian training, and she was a Jungian analysis, so she passed away in 2016, but she came up with this way of taking images from magazines, other, photographs you can use personal photographs, but it's basically on a 5x7 card like this, and you take a background, and then you either cut out animals or people or a combination of both. Try to keep it to 5 or 7 images, and once the collage is made, it's what we call the active imagination piece goes in, where you have a series of 4 questions, where you're talking to the card, and then the card is telling you, as Gloria had mentioned earlier, one of her first prompts is, I am the one who. It's a little hard to switch into that, okay, this card is talking to me, but it's just kind of looking at it and what is coming into your consciousness by looking at this card. Because when I say that they speak, they really do speak. It's a very powerful and almost immediate way for the psyche to open up. The other 2 prompts are, I need you to know, remember, or do, and the gift I bring to you is, and is there anything else you'd like to say to me today? So what I should when you're doing the expressive arts, it's like the psyche doesn't even, it's just right there. It's like, oh, yay, you're letting me speak. I want this, and this. I mean, I practice this all the time. I'm constantly making cards of my own, especially when I'm in some kind of my own kind of crisis, or whatever's happening with me, sadness, not knowing what to do in certain situations. And then the goal is to actually build your own deck. And it gets a little bit complicated, but you don't have to know all these things to just make one, because I've never seen anyone that I've worked with who's done this process with me not have a reaction in a certain way. Now again, some people don't want to answer the questions, or can't get into wanting to do that right away. That's okay, because in all of these processes, no one is ever forced to do anything. Like Gloria said, it's a step. But it's really fun. And you don't, it's really fun because you're cutting and you're making an image and you're looking at pictures and they're speaking to you. And then when the fun and the process is done, you feel good just because you gave yourself 15 or 20 minutes to get out of what do I do? How do I do this? I don't know what's going to happen. And just let yourself go into that space. See, that's where the healing happens. That's when transformation starts to happen, because over time, when you let these practices come into your life, you start to see life as in a very different way, because you're using a part of you that you really didn't know carried strength, carried wisdom, carried part of your ancestors, and speaks to the validity and the value of who you are as a person right now. You have dignity, you have strength, and you have a journey to go on, to be
And
here.
access to that journey through the creative
Access, yeah.
unconscious. So you talk about a portal of possibilities. Wow. So I want to thank you for kicking off our Griefology series. I will say next up, I think is Dr. Jackie Gutillo, who's going to speak to grief and the caregiver, and which is a whole other
Well,
element.
other thing.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn it back over to Greg and Polly and Sandy. Thank you so much.
Oh.
Your wisdom and your portals and your everything. Because it's not we can laugh. We can have these moments that tap into something that's not so funny sometimes. And that is also part of the healing process. So looking at that bridge in a whole different way.
I know. Isn't that, I didn't even
Wow.
put that together. Talk
know.
about synchronicity.
Yeah.
So, yeah. How do
That's a
we
tap, 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 tap. Okay, Greg and Polly, thank you.
You're welcome. So
Thank
Sandra,
you. Thank you.
before we go, just if anyone wants to schedule an appointment to start a Soul Collage, is there a way to get in contact with you?
I'm on Psychology Today, which is a website. I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. That has, it's a website that has a list of all the therapists in the Rhode Island, Massachusetts area. So I am on Psychology Today, and it does list on my profile the expressive arts that I use, as well as traditional therapy. So that's the best way to get in touch with me.
All righty. Thank you so much.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you. You
Thank
guys have
you.
a great rest of your day.
Yes.
You too. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.